Hey Collective, it's Alan coming to you with a standalone piece that will accompany a series of posts I've been releasing on the subject of some of the things that the higher ups are encountering as possible obstacles for the movement of the collective consciousness forward, and some of the more abstract or more occult-driven type of materials that advanced students are coming across that have specific wording and things that have either been deviated from or contorted to serve certain people's needs, or that were just maybe possibly misinterpreted. And I've been tasked with this video to kind of break it down for the audience in order to understand that there's something to be said about a time and space that something is documented and experienced, and the vessels of that current age then reflecting upon what they are parlaying with their own personality and with their own life experiences that may be a little bit more narrow or maybe a little bit different from what the actual intention or the impulse was that came to them. And so one of the things that is beginning to happen is that some of those things that have been phrased in, let's say, more of the esoteric literature did not age very well and has in and of itself become a crystallized form that cannot breathe and expand to meet the needs of the current society. And so one of the things that they have been working on as they develop and establish the ways in which society will be moving forward is that they needed to basically talk about the white elephant in the room. And they basically asked me, I got the impulse that it was important for me to kind of tackle it in a very graceful way, in an explorative fashion, if you will, helping the observers and those of your more advanced students to understand and make sense of the possibilities as to why certain rhetoric or certain wording has been forever captured in these sacred texts, as a means to remind people that in the end, any student can deviate from Scripture. In fact, anyone can go off script. And it's very important to remember at times that just because two people interact or read something doesn't mean that both people will come to the same conclusions as the other. And in point of order, anyone can make a mistake or use material or information that they interpret in a way that best suits their needs, even if it's not for the best of society. So it's important to understand as we explore this particular topic to remember that a lot of things that come to us from sacred texts or scriptures was given to personalities and beings that lived a particular time capsule in which they had to basically adopt their understanding of what they were receiving and put it into a vernacular that made sense for them, but that had kernels of truth of surrounding them, and it was up to the student to make their way through and navigate and discern what's true and what's not true for themselves. But because of what's going on in the current society with so much of the neo-Nazi return and so much of this idea of an Aryan nation, the topic of where that might come from became prevalent to what I needed to talk about. And after some deep meditation and kind of checking in with each of the higher powers here in my own construct, I decided that it would be best for me to approach it in the way that I'm about to. So one of the things that happens when people read scripture or read things is they can contort or contrast something that's stated to serve their needs, and they can pervert or deviate the information in a way that best suits whatever their aim or goal is. And in this particular situation, the terminology of Aryan nation, from my understanding as a spiritual student, began to have its roots in more of the esoteric faith with the Bailey writing and so forth, which was not intended to be utilized the way that it was, but Hitler and other members of that particular type of lodge decided to contort the truth of what was happening in 1925, and knowing that the movement was going in a particular direction, sabotaged it in a way where they took ownership of it and perverted the word Aryan. And so as I was looking deep into the subject and reading more of the Bailey writings and so forth, I started to encounter wording that really was of issue to me and to many other students that was reflective of what they were working on a conclave level, which was how do you move the species forward with so much information and wealth of knowledge available to them when there's so many ticking bombs within some of the wording that has been purposely set by deviated or perversions of truth. And in particular, when I was reading the stuff with Alice Bailey, one of the things I noticed is that she was talking a lot about something called the White Lodge and the Aryan Rays, R-A-Y-S, which of course became R-A-C-E. And one of the things about that is that if you read a lot of the esoteric literature, you find that they believe in something called the White Lodge, which is the more pure heavenly hierarchical structure that exists with a higher impulse of white light that beams it down into the Earth Academy and then creates the prism from which all color explodes. and it is made up of different colors that you would see, like when, let's say, a light hits a crystal and expands into the 7 rays of light, or how light interacts with certain molecules in silver to create rainbows. But that in and of itself, what they were talking about with the Aryan rays was from the White Lodge, meaning not from white people necessarily, as it was perverted, but from the purity of thought form from above that was being cast down into the shadowland and created to disperse. But that they were indeed part of a rainbow structure made of actual color, something that they did not refer to when Hitler decided to deviate and do all of this stuff to pervert it into what would be best suited for him to seek world domination. But essentially, the term Aryan rays is actually referring to the rays of light. And as you begin to read the subject matter, you begin to have little hiccups like that occur because of what happened after that. But if you use common sense as you read it as a student, as a disciple, as an adept, at wherever level you are in the evolutionary ladder, you begin to realize just how deviated and how perverted they got the information wrong. And one of the best ways to do so, and this is the part that I really had to meditate on, is to look at how the structure of faith is based, and to understand that at the head of this particular theosophy and theology and this practical way of thinking, there is a man by the name of Sanat Kumara, who is over our particular solar system. And the fact that his name is Sanat Kumara can be quite telling that he was not talking about Aryan race, he was talking about the Aryan rays of light. And the reason you can tell that is because Sanat Kumara is not an American name, it's not an English name, it's not a white person name, it's definitely a color name. And one of the things that we wanted to do with this is to remind people that in a lot of the more Blavatsky and a lot of the other sacred texts to talk about the Tibetan, that again, the master in question is from Tibet. He's not from an Anglo-Saxon environment. In the same way that the Buddha, who's an agreed upon master, is also not of Anglo-Saxon origins. He's from the East. And the reason they wanted me to point that out is because what's going on with some of the people is they're getting to a certain level where they're very curious about more of the advanced sacred knowledge, but they keep running into issues where, let's say, in Blavatsky's work, there are moments where the wording reflects the insecurity possibly, or just the personality of the person giving the oration, who's the dictator, in the way that she makes herself sound silly and she's just a woman and women can't do anything right, blah, blah, blah. And there's a real narrative there that exists that from wrong alignment looks as though the Tibetan is a misogynistic asshole, which is not the case. But if we look at the situation from a grounded now perspective, living in the culture that we are experiencing, we can then look back and realize, well, at the time, it's a male-dominated society. And during the male-dominated society, she would have been attacked, ridiculed, and possibly torn apart unless she got to the punchline first. Unless she did something that would make it a little bit less aggressive and a little bit more passive. But it did not age well because a lot of us then grew up understanding from reading it at first glance that the Tibetan has an issue with women and that women cannot, you know what I mean? Like, but yet she was the one who was receiving the data that then became what we call the esoteric faith and all of that. And so as we look back upon this, we, the current culture, are beginning to be able to see and receive the information that was in right alignment and giving the grace and understanding that just because the vessels that were parlaying the information may have had their own personality interjected into it, that to understand that we as the children of theirs, as the descendants of theirs, have the skill set and the common sense to now look at it and get beyond some of the more controversial or more questionable aspects to it. So returning back to the whole Aryan race thing. So Hitler must have stumbled upon this particular type of material because before he used the Aryan race to mean the white supremacy group, the Aryan race was really talking about the White Lodge and its impact and impulse over society in its evolution, and that it was clear, not white, but clear light beaming much like you would do in a projection, or projector, there it is. That you would put light into a projector, and the light that you would see in the old days when you would look up at a movie theater would be white light cast against a blank canvas. And that's where the crystallization would pop with color, and then you would see the film. And so if you understand it from that lens, it changes the conjecture, well, it changes the way you look at the word Aryan rays, and you refer to it more as an Aryan ray of light, meaning original white light, cast against the shadow, and it then creates the images in what we experience. But because he deviated from it, he kind of took something that was building momentum in its seedling stage and corrupted it to then mean white supremacy and this whole thing, neglecting the fact that within the same literature that he was corrupting were all of these people who are not of white descent. Now, I am not stating that there's anything wrong with being a white person. I've never had an issue with anybody of color, but you have to understand that within the logic of which he's deviating from, we're talking about rays of light, meaning the different colored rays that exist within humanity and within the greater construct of what creates color, and each of the colors has its own intention and has its own meaning and what purpose they're doing it, basically like departments that happen to be color-coded. So as you begin to explore some of this information, you're going to have to learn to discern the information and establish the best right relations you can and discern for yourselves what is true and what is not true. For example, I have made many, many times mention of the Pistis Sophia and the way that Paul was forever documented, where he had a major issue that's very clearly documented in Pistis Sophia with Mary Magdalene. In fact, went out of his way to basically tell her to shut up. Now, regardless of whether that actually happened or not, in that particular society, that would not have been uncommon. And I am not excusing the behavior because you guys know I've had an issue with this. But before a master or before an elder or before someone becomes a saint and whatnot, they have to work through such shadow. And he happened to be immortalized in a moment in time where maybe he wasn't where he needed to be yet, and he was reflecting the attributes and characteristics of an archetype that existed in that era. And that it's important to not demonize the name that they are basing it on and realize that it might be conjecture based on whoever was observing it and documenting the findings or documenting the conversation. Every one of us has our own life experience, and we have our biases and we have our perspectives. Oh my God, I just noticed how, I'm sorry guys, I have such an allergy right now, but I had to do the video anyway. But all of us have our biases, and our life experience dictates by the trauma that we've had, how we view the world. And until we start healing the traumas, it's really hard sometimes to see the hurt in other people. And sometimes we don't give them the grace to understand that for where they were in time and space, there were quite a bit of things that were quite different from who we are as their descendants, and that we need to understand that just because someone is documented in one way does not make it truth, because as we have seen, truth can be subjective in the wrong lens and can be adopted to corrupt an entire plethora of things in order to bring world domination. Because for those of you who have studied some of the more esoteric things, they talk about a one-world religion based upon its parts. But the way that it's being projected onto the world right now with this neo-Nazi, white supremacy, all of Aryan nation crap that's happening again, is that they want to basically have a one-world religion and a one-world government, neglecting the fact that it's made up of parts, and that they wanted to bring it into a whole, which was the concept behind the actual writing and the teachings. So what they've done is they've eliminated the different departments and want to basically own over humanity, enslaving them to one way of thinking, only one way of doing this, blah, 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 that would then neglect the masters and elders from different faiths, including the Buddha, the Tibetan, and all of these other figures, would be obviously counterintuitive and counter-constructive for where we're trying to go as an evolutionary model, and remembering that it is the sum of its parts, but acknowledging that it is the parts that make the whole that will move the species forward. So even in that context, we can see very clearly the deviation and perversion of facts to suit the needs of these particular people who are seeking power that is not theirs to have and eliminating the freedoms of other people based on what they read and misinterpreted and then spewed across the world into other ears that would hear them instead of the ears and eyes that can hear and see us having this conversation. So because of that, you begin to see the fray in their logic and where those words were perverted in the text that they are basing it from, and realize that they are so inept in what they were doing that they neglected the fact that the book still existed, and that we can see clearly that all of the rays of light have different department heads according to this theology. Have different department heads who, by the way, majority of them do not have white Anglo-Saxon names. So Aryan nation becomes clearly a reference to white light cast upon society, not a white race, R-A-C-E, that is so filled of coercion, corruption, and so forth. And that is not a sweeping generalization of any Anglo-Saxon people. In fact, I have no issue with them, but I'm talking about their philosophy of why they're trying to dominate the world, deport everybody of color, get rid of everybody that's not of their standard, and basically eliminate anyone who challenges them, which of course would be the opposite of why we have theology, theosophy, philosophy, and psychology. All of this is to understand the collective consciousness in its parts so as to move the species forward. And so as we begin to unravel their little web of deceit and lies, you begin to see that within the same literature that they are basing it on, they are contradicting themselves and are corrupting it to serve their own personal needs of greed and power. And it's important for us to really start talking about these things amongst the student body that is reading this material so as to help people get a better grasp as to what's happening. One of the things that happens when society begins to evolve and it begins to ascend and move forward in the evolutionary ladder is that there will be people who will do anything they can to corrupt data or to manipulate the masses in order to keep them small and to keep them controllable. And how dare you read something that's not under this heading and blah, 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 blah. Removing the scholastic experience of how we grow and learn as beings and how our souls evolve and ascend into higher levels of consciousness, and how without that, the race basically dies. But they don't believe in that. They took what they wanted out of the literature that would best serve them in order to pervert it into ways that would then bring dominance of a particular race of people, as opposed to the fact that within the same text, and this is important, it says that the Aryan race, the one that's cast from above, is also an impulse that controls India, which again is not an Anglo-Saxon, and it's literally the example they give within the text that you read, is that India is under the Aryan race, according to this literature. So obviously it's not under white people. They were talking specifically about the rays of light cast down helping that society move. It was India, part of the East, America, and the UK. All, by the way, having multicultural people and not having anything to do with the race of white, necessarily having to do with anything less than the fucking light cast down of purity of intention and will and meditation that brings the world forward. This is their own theology. And one of the things that we as students can now do is do what we have been tasked to do as this particular student body, which is to break down the barriers and the crystallizations that block thought form from evolving in a way that brings exploration and curiosity to the conversation without tackling or taking anybody else's faith structure away from them. And it's super important as we move towards this that you understand what's at stake. Because as I mentioned in the previous video before, we have things called group karma. We have, of course, individual karma that we must pay down. And we also have group karma. And we have national karma. And then we have world karma. And as we as a collective begin to move through this very trying next 7 years, I want you guys to remember that a lot of the things that are playing out make sense from a spiritual lens. And if you begin to unpack the data in the material, you begin to realize it's less driven by what the actual text was and more driven by deviation and perversion of fact in order to suit someone's needs or a group of people's needs. And it's going to take the due diligence of each student like you and I to break through the barrier and decrystallize these thought forms in order to help show the world that that was not what was said, in order to help other people maybe be able to approach the subject from a different place and be more open to the possibility that humanity is evolving in a positive way where we still honor each house of faith vehemently, and that each of them is equally important to the greater pie in the sky, if you will. And so as we move forward, it's important to understand that as we face our group, national, and worldwide karma, that you have to also remember that there makes perfect sense why the New World Order would be back and this Aryan nation bullshit would resurface, because a lot of the first world nations, as I've mentioned, did incorporate some of the Nazis as spies and intel and scientists that they then allowed to be free as long as they were in compliance with them. And that means that a lot of people didn't face any type of karmic retribution on behalf of the millions of people who were killed and slaughtered at the time. So we also inherit that. And then as you can see with what's going on with who's being allowed into the country right now, that happens to be from a certain particular thing that has a really dark history of slavery and so forth like that. That is all playing out, and it's very important for us to stay very grounded as we see it and come to the table and understanding why we're facing it again in order to finally resolve it once and for all, right? It's kind of like that in double indemnity. Some of the same souls that are present in this Earth Academy are direct descendants of the most worst of the assailants that created that era. And they're going to be paying for their family karma quite publicly. But it doesn't mean it's not going to be a trying era for everyone, and we won't have to stand and make sure that we fight for freedom, democracy, and all that other stuff. But we need to be able to do it cohesively and see the red flags as they play out. And one of the greatest red flags that you can do to ground your foundational energy is to realize that the text and stuff that they have deviated from literally does not speak to a one race world where it's RACE. They're talking about the unity of working together through each ray of light, which has, it has wisdom, it has love and compassion. Each department has a focus according to what they were referring to when they deviated and did all this, that has a specific function in the world. And as each of those rays manifest, they are supposed to work together and not be broken apart into one particular race of people owning the rest of the people. That's not what that says. But one of the things that I ran into when I was having the conversation internally with the higher up, if you will, of my higher mind, was the fact that not a lot of people were willing to talk about the subject, and I couldn't quite understand why. And the way that they phrased it was very interesting. The impulse that I got back was because society wasn't ready at the time to explore such topics, because it might question other things. And I said, well, that's great, but they're using this to become racist again. And we're on the track to do something where we might recreate what happened in World War II into a World War III situation. So if we don't unpack where the deviation came from and where the perversion of ideas came from, then people won't understand why we're facing this karma or why we're going through it. And because of where they want us to go, I needed to get on here and explain it from a student's perspective, communicating to other students within the spiritual communities to help us better grasp where we're going. Because when thoughts crystallize, they don't breathe, they don't move, and they stagnate. And just like William Meader has said before, the temple you build today will be your prison tomorrow. In this case, the prism that is the light being cast is now crystallized into a prison, and it's not moving. It's stuck in a time frame that does not match or keep pace with the society that is now on the board. And we, as students, are now tasked with the ability to review information in a way that doesn't necessarily trigger many people, but instead gives them the potentiality or the idea that the way that it was phrased may have been something related to the time period, or an insecurity, or just by life experience. And that we as adults now, looking back on it, can literally go, okay, so that's why this was said this way. Okay, then we can start breaking it down so as to break down the barriers between the houses of faith, who are now basically going to have to fight to stay in the picture. Because at this point, we're already seeing that they're trying to take books away, they're trying to take different philosophies away, and things like that are only going to get worse before the next 4 years is over, and then the 3 years that follow that to rebuild. So understand that a lot of what's going to be needed at this time is to help other people understand where the deviations come from in order to break ground and have breakthroughs with them, in order for them to find their peace and solace on their own journey. Because in the end, every soldier, every warrior, every soul must make the journey and the pilgrimage through the desert on their own. But as teachers, teachers' aides, as brothers and sisters, as a brotherhood and sisterhood that we are as a society, we can be there to help other people understand some of what lay at the root of some of the perverted aspects and some of the parts that don't really add up when you really stop and look at where this information came from. So in the end, what I want to close with is this is going to be one of those incredible times where you're going to see a lot of leaders step up in different ways. And one of the things that I've always said is that podcasts and different people with different perspectives brought together can be quite interesting. For example, a scientist or a philosopher speaking to a theologist or spiritualist, having dialogues like this can expand upon consciousness in a way that makes it interesting for other people. And it's going to be important for us to have the dialogues with each other and have the interest in the conversations that we're having to understand what truths lay at the root of something, and if we can help it be nurtured to growth again, or if it has decayed and become something toxic to the world. Because there's nothing more offensive to me than this idea that only a particular race is predominant over the rest of the race, when all of the masters, most of the masters that we call out and respect that are world known, have unwhite names, and they are of different descents, and they have mastered their own reality and walked the path of their own accord. And I'm not about to sit there and watch other people destroy them and remove them from the history books when they are part of the reason we're even at this evolutionary stance. But in order to understand where it was coming from, I needed to get on here and tackle the subject head on. And it really was the white elephant in the room. I was surprised that we hadn't really talked about it. It's only been inferred gently and some of the other people that I've run across. But that doesn't mean the conversation hasn't been had and hasn't been ongoing since the beginning of this year had, because of where we're going. But understand that the greatest way to break through to each other is to help other people understand perspective and give them potentialities or possibility as to why something was phrased that way or the time and space that it was said, in order to help people realize that it did not age well. I'm sorry, my sinus. The ageless wisdom is not ageless. Some of the things that have been said are not acceptable to this current society nor where we're going. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value and breadcrumbs that are really important for the soul or nourishment to a person who's in search of enlightenment. So understanding how to break through those things and how to decrystallize those thought forms in order to bring other people to the, oh, okay, I never considered that phase, is super instrumental to where we're going now. And please bear in mind that this should not challenge anyone's faith-based structure. I use specifically esoteric theosophy and theology because of the fact that that's what's been crossing my desk lately as part of where what we're doing next. And it's and how it brings about so many different faiths and stuff. But I'm not a speaker on behalf of them. I don't know anything about the Masonic Lodge. I don't know anything about any of that occult stuff. I'm just coming across this from a student's perspective, who the algorithm sends information, and then I read different books and stuff, because I'm one of those people who, like, if there's a possibility I can find insight and enlightenment, I'm going to study it. But as part of my own discernment process, there's been a lot of challenges that no one really talks about the wording. For example, I have a vehement issue about people treating women as misogyny and like this bullshit that they're secondary class citizens, so I had to get over that one. And then I had to get over the fact that they were talking about the Aryan and realized that they sabotaged and took the name Aryan from white light intentions cast down upon it to create the rainbow that then works together to bring the harmony and beauty, and the race. RACE is parallel to RAYS. And that's an important fact that we need to remind each other. Sometimes when you read somebody who is interpreting on behalf of the rays of light, will speak to it as the RACE. They won't understand that we're talking about rays of light. They will consider it race, right? Similar words, different meaning. And so as we encounter that, I then had to go over that hump. And then I really had to do the whole thing as a student about, well, is this a white supremacy fucking thing? Do they really think that they're this and that? And then I got to the word master, and that was a trigger point for me as well, because I'm like, the masters that we know are not the masters of the higher realm. The masters we know used to own slaves. I'm from New Orleans. I'm like, absolutely not. So all of these are like tests. But because of where we're at in evolution, basically the impulse I've gotten is we need to break through that once and for all to help people understand that there is no excuse for white supremacy anything, that is not what was said in those texts, and that they did change it and corrupt it to suit their own needs in their desperate search for power and the elimination of anybody else. And also to remind people that technically Jews are considered white, they're considered Anglo-Saxon, and those were the ones that were butchered and killed. So all of this bullshit is dismantled quite quickly if you just read the literature and find out for yourself. But as a student, one of the things that we're going to have to do is help other people see through the facade of what the student has done, or the person reading it, to serve their own needs, and give them the potentiality and hope that there was another reason why it was said that way. And so when it was all said and done, what I wanted to say with this video is understand that the world interprets data in the way that aligns with their own life experience. And if people have trauma or wounds that best serve their needs in search of power or some egoish trip, narcissism, whatnot, they will utilize information in tidbits without taking in the whole. My suggestion for those of you who are spiritualists is before you walk away from something, make sure you read the entirety of the material that's there, because the answers will lay in the body of the work, not the singularity of a thought word. And you have to look at the words that surround it in order to use your common sense and your history and ancestral DNA to decipher what's true and what's not true. So again, in conclusion, from this Aryan race misinterpretation, a lot of horrific things have happened, and it's almost like utilizing sacred texts and sacred literatures in the way that some people argue that the Bible has been used, and use it to serve their best needs of control and population and so forth. Here, what I'm going to say is this. At the head of this particular theology is someone by the name of Sanat Kumara. And as much as I respect everyone, this is the head of this particular ideology. And one of the things that's very noticeable is that his name is Sanat fucking Kumara. It's not senior. It's a word of color. There's a connotation here that they came from another part of the world, from a different color race, that they're not Anglo-Saxon, and that is the head of this particular theology. Then you have the fact that the Buddha is not from a white culture, and then you realize in the subject matter that technically he is. You see, in this theology, India and parts of the East and some of the Himalayas and so forth are under the impulse of the white rays from the White Lodge, who are helping the development of that particular group of people, and that they are technically under that guidance. But notice that they're not white people. It's not Anglo-Saxon communities that are in that area. These are Indians. These are Asians. These are Hispanics. These are, Latin. A lot of sacred texts came through Latin. And yet those are the ones who are being persecuted or somehow going through all this battle and turmoil. And it's important for us to speak about it so as to help other students get over the hump. Because regardless of whether you take a truth on or not, one of the things about knowledge and education is that you have to then help other cohorts and other students understand that the way that things are depicted is not always necessarily truth. And it's up to the student and the teachers and the faculty and those of you who are here for the next leg in the introduction of the 6 root rays. It's important for you to help other people be grounded in their approach and realize that just because someone says that this is what this means does not mean that it is the truth. And you yourself will have to do the due diligence and the work of going into the sacred text and reading it for yourself in order to establish whether or not you agree or disagree with something. But in the end, what I'm saying is it's important to remind ourselves to not take everyone else's opinion on for ourselves, instead do the work to read it. Because once I read the entirety of it, and I've been listening to one of the other books right now of initiation, once I got through those blocks, I started to realize that what was being said and the perversions and the way that it was phrased was based on the mental space and the evolutionary placement of the individuals that were having to try to parlay the information and who may have misinterpreted in the same way that Hitler did, right? Although I don't think he did it accidentally. For him, I feel like it was an intentional piece of knowledge that he gleaned that he could use for his advantage. And all hell broke loose. But that tends to happen, and that's an important aspect that I will close with. Anytime the conclave meets, or anytime any type of spiritual or evolutionary advance or leap of faith will be required of the people, the Dark Lodge does this thing of taking what it knows and perverting it so as to block people from fully understanding it and being fearful of being able to move on. And the job of a lot of us now is to help dissipate that in order for people to see through the veil of bullshit and get to the truth of it of their own accord and have them walk, because in the end, they are perfect. They are the only ones accountable for their own life experience. And in the end, they will be judged individually, and we will be judged as group with karma. But in the end, we stand on the mountain alone. And it's important to help people stand on the mountain in their own alignment and to help them get past some of the pitfalls and tests that are there that used to be super important, that is now at such a detriment because of what is literally happening around us, that we need to kind of help them get to where they need to be to understand it. And so in the end, I just wanted to bring this piece, even as sick as I feel with the allergies and stuff. I just wanted to come on here and let you guys know that there's a lot going on externally. But what we can do is educate ourselves, especially if we sense that they're going to start stripping us of the rights to certain books and stuff, which is coming. And the way that things are happening that are illegal in many... So as these things happen, education and knowledge are power. And it's important for us to be empowered at this stage of life in order to stay grounded and navigate through the seas of uncertainty, the coercion, the bullshit, and lies. In fact, I recently saw something quite incredible over there on Rogan's podcast about some of the manipulation they use on media platforms and stuff. All of this is a wealth of knowledge that is available to us. And so when you tap out of Marvel Universe and you tap out of the narrative BS of being either left or right, you are left on your own to research and discover things. And it's important that you take the context in its wholeality, if you will, into consideration before you cast things away that may be of benefit to you in understanding. For I am not a psychic. I am just someone who's reading the sacred text and following the ball that's moving across the screen. And the accuracy is based on the fact that I have been keeping up with my studies. I'm no special than anyone else. I'm just doing the work required of me, and what I'm saying to you all is keep up the good work and keep reading it, because you too will dispel the untruths and free yourself from this idea of that. And when you see the truth of it and you realize where it came from and you read it and you realize that's not what was said, suddenly the entire empire or stronghold that they think they have completely falls apart before your eyes. You're like, that is not what they're saying. And once you realize that for yourself, you're empowered to just not pay attention to it as much. I mean, obviously we have to face the karma and stuff. We're all going to have to do that together. But you don't get sucked into the anger and all of it because you see where the deviation, perversion, and the malintent came from. And so in the end, education is power. And this is the time that we have before things start being stripped away, that you guys have the opportunity to research of your own accord some of this literature. You don't have to be in one of these houses of faith to believe in it. But sometimes when you're exploring stuff and you find where something really dark came from and realize it was not ever intended to be that way, you can then take a step back and go, oh, this motherfucker right here. And it gives you that sense of freedom. So in the end, do the work. I'm sure you guys are going to do great. I really hope that more of this dialogue happens with other people. It's interesting to do it just as like a particular post here on LinkedIn. I don't even know who's going to see it. But at the end of the day, it would be much more interesting to have different philosophers, different theologists, different esotericists, different scientists, different logical minds, so forth, talking about some of where all of this confusion is coming from and letting the audience hear the organic exploration and the decrystallization of thought forms that were meant to advance and evolve that are stuck and stagnant because nobody wants to move forward. And yet if we explore the topics more in-depthly as an adept, then what ends up happening is the world grows and we break through barriers and we realize that some of the greatest obstacles we think are there were never there to begin with. And I'll leave you guys there. Bye.